Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, I guess, if you're joining us from a different time zone. Welcome to another episode of the Uncertainty of Show with Gary Wong and our special guest today, Andrew MacKenzie. Today, the topic is Wayfinding Change, Mechanics and Gardeners. And last month, we introduced the uncertainty of wayfinding through the unknowns of safety. This is part 2 of wayfinding, where we use a simple definition of wayfinding: orientation, route decision, route monitoring, destination recognition. So wayfinding is the process of orienting oneself and navigating from one place to another. According to Wikipedia, the 4 stages, which I just mentioned, the orientation, the route decision, and the route monitoring and destination recognition. And Gary had then described what are the unknowns in each basic system of the real world. So those 3 types of order systems were known knowns. So this is explicit documented knowledge. The known unknowns is what we call risk. And we know about it, but don't know how often or how big it will be. And then the unknown unknowns is the tacit knowledge, which is in a person's head, but hasn't been explicitly shared. And then the complex system of the unknown unknowns, what we don't know is what you don't know. So the chaotic system we talked about as well, unknowables, so beyond our current capacity to understand or discover the mysteries of the universe, as an example, and the unimaginables, beyond the realm of what we can conceive or comprehend. And if it's negative, it's often referred to as that black swan catastrophe. And if positive, a totally unexpected, out of the blue discovery like insulin. In the sales world, we call those bluebirds when they come flying in the window. We ended with the 3 takeaways for the viewers. Started with the certainty of the present. Engage your workers in what they naturally do best, tell stories, and wayfinding is navigating what is inherently uncertain to not only minimize risk, but also to take opportunities as they arise.
Well, thanks, Scott, for that. Welcome, everybody, as well. So what we've been exploring in the Uncertainty of Show has been what we call the age of cognitive complexity. So previously, we talked a bit about humans as storytellers, how stories form patterns, and the human brain is designed to actually recognize patterns. So today, I'd like to welcome Andrew back to our show, which we are titling The Uncertainty of Wayfinding Change. So last month, Andrew shared a few of his fascinating experiences with storytelling and culture. Today, he's going to talk about his role as a change manager. So last month, Andrew and I walked you through a live demo using SenseMaker software to generate maps from stories. This is the SenseMaker process. We always begin with the certainty of the present by collecting employee narratives and their true life experiences. What we analyze is what ethnographer Tricia Wayne calls thick data, which answers the emotional why question. Narratives can also answer the destination question, are we there yet? Or due to the arrival of new information, not previously known, why are we going there? And why shouldn't we be going there? Because I think that's a better place to go. We gave people access to the Safety Pulse Collector online. It's a demo that I designed for the safety community. Then we oriented ourselves with the dashboard. So you enter a story, and then you can actually see your story show up on this dashboard. The key point is that since the maps are constantly refreshed with new narrative data, it's really easy to monitor progress visually by seeing how the patterns are shifting over time. Terms we use today are distributed ethnography, where everyone is a storyteller and gatherer. We use the term distributed cognition, What does that mean? That means everyone gets to add their thinking to the big picture. So this isn't the traditional way of, well, we're the supervisors, we're the C-suite, we do all the thinking and the rest of the people do all the doing here. In distributed cognition, we recognize that everybody can contribute and they can add their thinking to the big picture. We just need to find the tools to make it really easy for that information, their knowledge, to be shared with us. And then we also talk about another term, disintermediation. What does this mean? It means that no one gets their story misinterpreted or filtered. So if you look at the traditional Likert surveys, what you do, you fill out the survey. I, perhaps as a consultant or analyst, I look at all the data and I look at the stories and then I filter them through my lens saying, oh, I know what that person said. Well, in our sense-making software, there is no filtering. The C-suite gets to read the stories and interpretations directly from the storyteller. So you can't get more of an authentic voice than that. So last month, what we did, just part of the recap, is that we checked off 2 of the stages, orientation and route monitoring. So today, we're going to take a deeper dive into wayfinding change with route decision and destination recognition. So I did mention last month that SenseMaker can generate XY landscape maps, which look like this. And that's how they can inform our change interventions that we plan to do. These are just 2-dimensional maps, which display contour lines and clusters where feelings are being commonly expressed. In this illustration, the red X are narratives where rules were being bent to get work done with low quality. Not a place we want to be, but that's what's happening in your organization, for example. The green check where high quality work is being done, and it's being done within the rules. I think we'd all agree that's the destination that you want to be, and you want to see where a lot of stories like this are being shared. So the intuitive route decision is to move from red X to green check mark. And that means something that's quite different for people involved in change managers or change agents. The change intervention question now becomes, what can you change to get fewer undesirable stories and more desirable stories? And what we've discovered when we've done this, it's so much easier for people to talk about a story and a destination as opposed to trying to describe that using some terms of what this is and its characteristics and everything else here. It's so much easier because people can hear that story and say, oh, I've done that. I can do that. So it's easy for people to quickly hear somebody's story and say, I can do that, or I cannot do that unless we have some changes being made here. That helps. That makes for a very healthy conversation. Like, what are some of those little changes that we have to adjust so that you can move towards that green check mark? So route decision involves navigating through the unknowns, which Scott already talked about. Typically involves stick handling through a bunch of change projects, and it's asking, are we on the right route? Are we there yet? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Andrew to step up to the plate, since it's baseball season, why not? And ask about his experience as a change manager implementing a feedback system that answers these 2 questions. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of a background on this before we start. So with one of my previous employers, we had an injury prevention rate. So each manager was, their KPI was to provide total recordable case rate. So this is your accidents, how many you had, and of course your injury prevention rate. So what activities are you taking to improve your health and safety? So in all fairness, if you had a lot of staff, so say 350, 400 or higher, 1 or 2 accidents could be absorbed. You're not going to exceed the rate that it was expected of your site. But if you had A smaller site, say about 150 people, that one accident, you're completely blown out of the water for the next year because it was in a rolling average. So really, I've never been a big fan of tracking that. I mean, yes, it's great. We need to know those statistics, but I would prefer to look at what are we doing to improve our injury rate. So these are the things that actually prevent the accidents. So what we ended up doing is when I first started my role, the rate was set, the injury prevention rate was set at 2 or 3. Very low number, should be easy to achieve. And I got a call from the manager from Europe and say the person that created the rate calculation. He said, well, how is it your team are in the high double digits? So when I say double digits, I mean, I'm talking in the teens. Yet Europe and Asia were struggling just to crack 2. Weren't even reaching target. I said, that's a good question. I'd only been in the role for about a week. I'd already been working with the people for a few months at that point in time, but I'd actually been officially put into the role. So I said, well, look, I'm getting everybody together at one of our plants down in the US there. I'm going to ask them how they got that number. So at the time, we were using a very rudimentary database, and it really only captured near misses, first aids, near misses, and behavior-based safety observations. And then they had one box that what I called that was the happy dumping ground, because everything else went into it. So I said to everybody, I recognize what the first aids and the behavior-based near misses are, how they go into the calculation, but what does the everything else represent? And I got varying opinions from across the floor because everybody had a different opinion what their numbers represented, because it was just a number. It didn't have anything attached to it. So together we conclude we need to come up with what we call the core 5. So 5 things that we're going to go into our injury prevention rate. First aids were not counted in there, but behavior-based safety, near misses, safety kaizens. Now, just for anybody that's not familiar with safety kaizen, it's a lean term meaning an improvement. So safety kaizens were counted. Inspections, what we were starting to count was how many actions came out of your inspections, and then reported hazards. So these were the core 5. And because our database wouldn't capture this stuff, I had a secondary database that I kept. And I inherited this when I stepped into the role, so I just kept it going. And what I discovered from reading through it is that I could get a sense of where the trends were happening with the sites. So I could look at a site and say, okay, I'm looking at 3 or 4 years worth of data. All of a sudden, I'm starting to see a trend. So I'm thinking that come, say, August or September, from your statistical data, including your incidents that you've had, by September, we're expecting you're going to have an accident. So I need you to step up, and step up your injury prevention activities, and these are the areas you need to focus on, because we can look back and see where their accidents are happening. So this is all fine and dandy, and I was tasked with creating an injury prevention standard. Well, I worked on this for a couple of years, and it was just not really coming together. I was trying to come up with a visual, and then all of a sudden we had an accident on one of my sites, and really, without going into too much detail, it was a rather nasty one that ended up with a person going off permanently. And when we did our investigation, there was 3 of us from all parts of the world doing the investigation remotely, because it was the tail end of COVID. And what we did was we determined that the management team and the supervisors on site really didn't have a good sense of what was happening on the floor, because the incident happened. It happened in a silo, in the sense that nobody knew what was going on, that this activity had been going on, apparently been going on for a few years. So when we discovered it through the accident investigation, we just realized that, the safety committee really is not effective to really analyze this stuff. So that's when it just started pulling everything together. We came up with the concept of the grinder. If you could slide back to that there. The image of the grinder, we want something visual that people could connect to. And what it was is that we came up with all the inputs that we wanted the safety committee to analyze each month, which in this case happened to be first aid, behavior-based safety, near misses, safety kaizens, inspections, hazard reports, investigations, and safety audits. So these were the inputs. So what would happen each month, that the safety advisor on the site would provide this information to the safety committee. The safety committee would analyze this data and start to look for some trends that have happened over the last month, and then use that data to create the outputs for next month. So actually creating a marching orders, if you like, for all the staff. Now, just to keep in mind, this committee was made up of your typical management members. So you got management members, so you've got supervisors and senior management, plus you've also got the worker members. So everybody's got an input, everybody's got a say here. So from the data they analyzed, they would say, okay, next month for behavior observations, you're going to be focusing your attention on 4 items. So 4 key items, and this came out of the analysis of all the other data from last month. These are the safety kaizens that need to be created. So everybody on site was tasked with creating at least 1 to 2 kaizens per month. That was just part of their job. So everybody on the floor, managers and workers alike, would do this. Inspections. So we would say, okay, these are when you're doing your inspections, here's 4 key items you need to focus your attention on. We need to provide training. So let's provide this training for the people this month. So we're going to do a blitz on that. Here's some safety programs we need to reemphasize or need to redevelop or review. Safety standards, same thing. We will review these, update them as required. Then safety campaigns, and this was a kind of a neat one that came out of my one of my sites in Mexico. What they did was they would actually have a calendar of events that would be planned out for the whole year. And so it may be this month we're going to do breast cancer awareness. Next month, we're going to talk about safety kaizens, but they would do a blitz on different topics depending on what came out of these meetings. Now that we've got these plans all set in place, somebody has to enact them. So that'd be the next slide, I believe, Gary. There we are. So what we have here is now the company had 4 types of meetings. They had a Loop 1 meeting, which would be the supervisor talking to the charge hands or lead hands. A Loop 2, which would be the lead hands talking to their team, having a crew talking about what's on the safety cross. We'll go to that in a minute as well. Then there was a Loop 3 meeting, and that's a daily management meeting. They had it on the factory floor, so they actually had a cubicle set up, and everybody stood up and they talked. So it would start with safety, and they would go around the table and they talk about production and what have you, like that. And then Loop 4 was a monthly meeting, which was a recap of everything that was talked about in the Loop 3 meetings during the month. So when they're in these meetings, they're talking about the safety talks that are got to be done this month. They're talking about the safety cross, and the safety cross was essentially it's just a cross. And if memory serves me correctly, everybody kind of did a little differently. But what the idea was is if you didn't have an accident that day, you got a green square. But the caveat was is that you had to have done your safety kaizen, a daily safety kaizen. So somebody from your team had to have done one. So therefore, the square got slashed, and if there was a red mark, that meant that you didn't get your safety kaizen done like you should have done. So if you wanted a full green, you had to have your daily talk done, and you had to have done your safety kaizen. So that's how that part worked. And again, this was communicated through the meeting, through the managers. So they actually had to discuss this with their team leads, and they also talked about it in the meetings. Then their IPR reports, that would be where you're at this month. So, are we meeting the target? So again, we started it with a target of 3. By the time I left there, they were in the high 20s, and that was the expectation. So, and again, it was a rolling average. So it was averaged up throughout the last year, and depending on how many employees you had, would set the amount of activities you had to do each month and each year throughout the year. So that would be discussed. And then safety culture assessments, these were done typically on a quarterly basis, but depending on the site. One of our more progressive plants down in Brazil actually did them on a monthly basis. And they use that data to review and improve their safety programs. And these guys are the ones that went 7 years. When I left, they were sitting at 8 years without a recordable injury. And that was really impressive considering they had 2 separate operations there. And it was just amazing. So we actually we used to have a monthly meeting where I got all my safety managers from throughout the Americas, and I would pick your site and say, okay, I want you to talk about this, that, or the other thing. So everybody really kept on pushing me. We need to find out how Brazil is doing it. So we actually had a meeting, and we just devoted the whole hour to them explaining to us the secret to their success. And that was again using the safety. Part of it was their safety culture assessments being used on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, great. Okay. I don't know if my face has disappeared on your screen. Am I there? No, I'm there. Okay.
No, you're there.
Yeah. So what I found intriguing, Andrew, when you shared your story of the grinder was this is not something that you put in overnight. This is something you had to build over a long period of time. And I was really fascinated by how you drew in all the different plants and other people. They all contributed in there to kind of build up what you have, which is this grinder. And what I like about these sort of diagrams is that if you had to explain this thing, you could actually take a napkin and write this on the back of a napkin to easily explain it. And we always talk about that is that if you're going to show a model or a framework, have something that you can just quickly bang together with the back of a napkin, then people can get it really quickly. So keep it simple if you like, and do this much. Of course, I was really intrigued and fascinated because when I saw the word safety culture assessment, of course, bells are going off in my head saying, oh, wow, that's the sort of things that we talked about. Of course, using humans as storytellers. So one of the key things I wanted to look at with you was, do you kind of see some opportunity here where you can actually take all the a SenseMaker dashboard and complement this sort of a grinder system?
Sorry, I had myself muted. Yes, I can see this definitely being part of it, and especially everybody has a different way of doing the safety culture assessments. And again, when I first started with the company, they handed out the paperwork each month, and they said fill that in. And of course, people do what they typically do, and everything's excellent. Then they bitch and whine about how horrible things are. So I went and talked to them, and I said, well, the next time I went to give the safety culture survey, I handed them out personally, and I said, your name is not going anywhere on this. I want you to tell me exactly what you tell your spouse when you go home. If you think your boss is a so-and-so, tell us, because if you don't tell us there's a problem, we'll assume everything's just hunky-dory, and from now and nothing will ever change. But if you want to see change, you got to tell us what's going on. Make us aware of what the problem is and what your suggestions are. Because don't come to me with a problem without a solution in hand. Boy, I tell you that when I got the survey results back the next time, the numbers plummeted. But at least now we had a place to start.
Yeah.
And that was really the key to it.
Yeah, yeah. And we've had experiences with other engagements where you don't have to just confine the storytellers to be your employees. They could be your suppliers. They could be contractors, because how often do we see that, okay, part of your culture is all the people that work for you, and that includes suppliers, it includes contractors. You could even expand the collector, say, oh, Mr. Customer, Ms. Customer, would you like to enter a story about some experience you had with one of our people? What sort of stories do they tell? And of course, we do that in some cases in customer satisfaction surveys, but often they are a separate database. What makes sense for us, Andrew and Scott, is why don't we put that all in one database that we can slice and dice and see how different people are feeling? There's a great story about, I think it was down in Australia that was done. And it was with a colonel that had just moved to a new camp. And he wanted to find out exactly if the troops liked the camp. And the suggestion was, what the people you got to talk to, because all the soldiers would say, oh yeah, it's fine, it's good, whatever. Somebody suggested, I tell you what we can do. Why don't we ask the spouses who are there in the camp how they feel about it? And wow, like everybody's eyes were opened up saying, this is good, but you haven't done this, you haven't done that. So I gave the colonel, oh, these are the things that we got to work on, because it's not just keeping the soldiers happy, it's keeping the soldiers and their families happy as well, if we want to be a successful sort of regiment there. So that was a nice learning. There's something else you told me about, which is really interesting, and it fits well with what we do. What's this thing about an inch pebble at a time?
Sorry, I love that one. Actually, I did a change management course, and I'm going to do a quick plug for the Excellence in Manufacturing Consortium. I did an excellent change management course with them, and I'm sure this one's stolen from somewhere else, but they kept on mentioning inch pebbles. And at first I was like rather puzzled by this. And they said, well, you've heard of milestones. Well, yeah, milestones are one thing, but inch pebbles are those microscopic or small pieces that it takes to get you moving forward. Because again, if you're measuring things by milestones, it may take a long time to reach that. But an inch pebble, it gives you a feeling that, hey, we're moving ahead. Maybe 1 inch at a time, but by God, we're moving ahead. So inch pebbles.
Great.
I've actually got it on I got it on a sticky note on my computer.
There you go.
Just for giggles.
Yeah, good. And some of the other benefits as we talk about that is if you've got a qualitative sort of context that complements, because you're right, the grinder is somewhat big data. It generates all the numbers that are necessary to keep regulators happy, the board of directors knowing that, okay, we're on track, stuff like that. But of course, with quality data, you can now be alerted to those weak signals. And you talk about Kaizen stuff, the emerging opportunities and emerging risks. So again, it's trying to get ahead of the curve before something bad happens. And that's what we want to do. I think we also had the conversation as well about your grinder being, oh, look at all of the inputs and outputs here. And if you change the knob, what happens? So you want to talk a bit about our conversation about interacting with knobs. Remember that?
Okay, so this is dating myself completely here, but I'm old enough to remember when you had to fine tune a TV and or radios of the day, and it was just a microscopic change at a time. Then step back and is it working? No, okay, get back out there and do it again. And of course, I was the youngest in the family, so I was the one that always had to stand by the TV or tune the aerial to make sure. Okay, Gary recognizes what I'm talking about. So the point is that sometimes nothing is going to happen immediate, and if it is happening immediately, then it should have been obvious long before then. But there's other stuff that takes a lot more fine tuning to get it to where you want it. And I mean, I was just having that conversation with my people on the floor today. I'm not going to go out there and wield a hammer and say everything's got to be. I'm going to go down and have a conversation and share my experience with the people on the floor who are going to have an influence on others on the floor, and share my story with them, or an experience with them, and let that kind of gel in their mind and see what decisions they come up with from that. So it's just fine tuning a little time, or as I say, inch pebbles. So you're not going to have a dramatic result, but you're going to inch along.
Yeah, I think now we know a bit more about complexity and complexity science. We also understand too that if you change one knob, it can affect other knobs. So you may have to turn them up, turn them down as well. And this is this interaction of knobs with each other, and I don't want to really talk about people being knobs, but that's what people are. They're all interacting with each other. And the uncertainty that we're faced with is the uncertainty of what the output will be from all these things being changed. In some cases, that makes it exciting, but it also means that we have to be always on alert to see, like, oh, that's an unintended consequences that's arising. We better dampen that and turn a knob down or something around like that here. So I can see how that this whole grinder really helps the safety committee as well, because it helps them to coordinate learning and allocate resources. So just a quick wrap of this from an IT perspective, because if you have anybody on there, what the strategy is from an IT perspective is you start with what you have now. And that could be an SMS. It could be a software as a system. It could be a SharePoint database. Doesn't matter what it is. The whole idea is that you don't replace it, but you complement it with a narrative database to answer the why questions. Then that provides the contents behind the numbers when you're asked, okay, what does 5.2 mean? Well, you can now look at the context behind that because you've got the stories. We often talk a bit about, the impact of AI, artificial intelligence. I'm really not there. I'm more interested in context intelligence. I think that's what we really need to know about. Give me intelligence that provides a context that helps me understand what's really happening here. Okay. So the full title of today's show is Wayfinding Change, Mechanics or Gardeners. So let me sort of explain what the heck this is all about. And I'll take you back to then this diagram, which we always start with. And what we say with change is that change is really not one size fits all. We do need different tools for each basic system required. So as Scott already talked a bit about, we have the ordered system, which is very predictable. It's stable. We have these if-then causal relationships. And the patterns of behavior that we see, they're very constant and they're very steady. So what I'm going to suggest is that, oh, if we've got that, this is what we need. We just need mechanics tools. And there's my little picture of a bunch of mechanics tools. We're working with a lot of knowns. And the unknowns that are known, we can risk assess them. So there's no big problem. And I would say 95%, 99% of the time, we're actually every day working in this system with mechanics tools. We're using best practices and things like that. And we're really emphasizing productivity and getting things done. And we can rely on tools. And if you're into change management, you will recognize some of these tools. These are tools such as POSI change management, or you can have lean. And Andrew, you talked about lean already as being a set of tools. They are in the ordered system. And we talked about linear road mapping. And the little diagram I got showing there is I did some road mapping, laying out blueprints, if you want to call them, with senior management, but laying a path of where you want to go. And it's usually typically going to the top right corner of your map. These were great for communication, letting people know in 3 or 5 years, this is where we're going to be. Of course, when I do these things, back then, 3 or 5 years was pretty stable. Now today, we have a bigger an issue where maybe this map may be good for a week, if that, before things change on this, right? You can think about, the terrible wars that we're having right now. You cannot have these sort of maps. The strategy that they're having to play is, what did the enemy just do and how do we react and respond to that? But if you are in the ordered system, which is fine, just understand that with practice and experience, what we were doing is that we're really strengthening the robustness of our organization. And robustness is definitely what we need in order to produce things and get work done. Of course, now we know that there's also the complex system where the future is uncertain, it's unpredictable. Relationships, man, they're messy, they're entangled. All these little knobs being turned, interact with each other. So we get patterns of expected behavior, but boy, they're constantly changing, hidden. Maybe they don't even exist. Why? Well, because feedback. Feedback loops deliver consequences. And then what happens, because we're humans, we will adapt our behavior from the consequences that we receive, good or bad. So what we're saying is that mechanics tools really won't work in the complex system. So we must be aware that the trouble is that because we've become really, really good at using things like hammers in our mechanics toolkit, everything looks like a nail to be pounded, even if it's a screw. And if we're not careful, we can do damage and worsen the current conditions due to unknown unknowns. And I've had one person in one workshop kind of exclaim, said, Gary, not only do that, we'll take the hammer and we'll keep on pounding the screw to the point where we actually damage the wood, and wondering why the screw won't go into it. So that's where you got to step back going, you know what? I think we need a different set of tools. And of course, the tools that I'm talking about are gardening tools. So what are gardening tools? Well, think of ourselves as gardeners. Now we can think instead of an engineering sort of world where mechanics are just thrive on, we're now into more of an ecosystem where gardeners, what do? Well, we provide water, we add fertilizer to the soil, and we plant those seeds. So now we shift to creating the nurturing conditions for seeds to grow. But a lot of uncertainty there because we don't know if the plant will flourish or whether it's going to die. That's some of the certainty that we have to deal with. Now, gardening tools, what they do is that they build resilience. So mechanics tools, robustness, gardening tools, they build resilience. And when I talk about resilience, then I can talk about some other different tools like that. And let me explain those to you. So what we need is we need to stimulate those interactions, get those little knobs talking to each other here. Because what they're doing is that they're building a root network, no different than in a garden. And a lot of experienced gardeners, particularly if you're building a victory garden, as they call it, they know which plants put to next other plants because they know the roots underneath there, they're entangling, they're connecting, they're actually building with each other this strong network below the ground here. So again, your examples, Andrew, of getting the different plant workers interacting with that, you're building this network. And what's really cool is that this informal network carries on without you there. You're going to have these managers from one plant to another plant talking to each other here. And what you've done as a gardener is enable that to happen, which is cool. So the other thing we got to do, of course, is that we've got to monitor the current gardening conditions here. So this is where timeliness comes in, because today's weather reports versus last week's, well, last week's weather report doesn't do us any good. So lag data is great if you're in the order system, not so good if you're in the complex system, because you want data as quickly as you can. And then this is why we talked about already about having these IT databases that empower people to connect the dots. You have the big data core 5, and now you've got the thick data and narratives to provide context here. And then we can use these narrative maps to see these patterns that are changing and seeing where the unfavorable and the desirable behaviors are popping up. Now, going back to your inch pebbles, now we have the ability to do small changes rather than big launches. Right? So what we want to do are those change conditions to accelerate more desirable patterns of behavior. How can we get more stories over in that green check mark area? That's the question we're going to ask. And so some people ask me, like, why small? Well, the reason why we want them small is that we want to reduce the risk of unintended negative consequences going viral. Again, back to the analogy of turning the knob. If you turn the knob and all of a sudden you get a big squelch, well, you don't want that squelch to be so large that it impacts the other knobs, and then before you know it, you've just got runaway chaos here, right? You've got to be able to manage that. Okay, oh, that didn't work. Better decrease that a bit here. And so you can manage the size of your experiment here. And so what we do is that we can either dampen or abandon the initiative before it gets out of hand. Now, if you look at my diagram, if you heard about nudging, that's from the world of behavioral economics. Really what we're talking about is micro-nudging. More stories like these, fewer like that, is just micro-nudging. And then we're just kind of prodding people. Can you go from here to over there? And that's going back to, again, looking at your route and looking at your designation here. And we just nudge people there. And we nudge people by changing some of those gardening conditions. So some of those gardening conditions, like fertilizer, water, while in the safety world, those are rules. Oh, maybe we can bend this rule or change this rule, or maybe change this policy. Or, instead of this crew working together, why don't we try a different crew makeup? All these things that you can manage, and you can just test that out here. Let's create a whole different crew with 3 people with this skill set and see how that works. That's a kind of like a nudge. Then you can collect stories from the fellows going, that really worked, or no, that sucked. That didn't work. We're missing something there. So what are we doing? We're actually learning. And this is the other part about doing what we call safe to try experiments, as I'm showing there. What we do is that we can engage many people on what we call learning teams what do? They can conduct safe to try experiments. And the whole idea is to learn. Is this the right fertilizer? Is this the right crew makeup? They can also play what we call educated hunches. Because not everything is always a problem. There are times when an emergent opportunity is worthy to probe. And let's not get into that thing about, oh, it's only the senior manager supervisors that think of creative ideas. We're all very creative beings, and you may have a worker on the front floor, on the floor saying, I think if we did it this way, I got a hunch this could be better. Can I go and try that out? And what you want is you want to have that culture that says, yeah, let's support that. Let's give you some resources. Maybe, do you need anybody else to work with you to kind of see if this is an idea? It may or may not work, who knows? But the whole idea isn't really about success, because you can learn from failure as well. And the whole idea is about learning. Now, learning is a whole new topic on itself. And when we talk about learning, I've done different shows on Meet the Author on the Safeopedia platform. And a couple of folks I recommend, good colleagues of mine, are Brett Sutton. He's at the Learning Teams, Inc., and he's done some wonderful stuff on learning teams, written a few books, which we reviewed on Meet the Author show. Also had Bob Edwards and Andrea Baker on as well, and talking a bit about how do they work with operational teams as well. A couple of books there for you to look at. Scott, I think we can put the links probably, when we publish this on YouTube so people can look at these things. I think there's a wealth of knowledge that we can learn there. Now, typically, we're great. We know what's happening in the ordered. We know what's happening in the complex. Yeah, but there are times when we run into that third system called chaos. So what happens there? Well, we need a different set of tools here. A little bit different anyways, because now we're in that role that we got to stabilize the situation and get the heck out of there really, really quickly. Because we want to be in order. We want to be in complex. We don't want to be in chaos, because that's typically where damage takes place. And by the way, if leadership isn't there and there's a leadership vacuum, we will see a complexity phenomenon called self-organization happen. People will wait around only so long before taking action on their own to survive. And we see that in spades. If you even look at, the hurricanes that they're having down in southeast part of US. We talk, there's FEMA at the top, and there's a government, and there's a governors, but a lot of local people, communities, they are getting together to find ways to survive. And, thank God, that humans have this nice desire to survive, so they will self-organize and they'll get together and do that together here. Now, having said that, we may need some other tools, and just for fun, I kind of threw this tool in here because maybe we have to fight off and shoot unimaginables like bad aliens and zombies. Hopefully we won't have to do that too often here. Okay. So that's really it. We've got a shorter show today because I think you've got a hard stop at the top. So what we did today is really have a conversation about managing a change portfolio projects. And I think things I learned, Scott, from the Safety Connect show last week, there's a wide audience of people that are from large organizations, but I really realized there's a lot of people in the small, medium size as well. They don't have a lot of resources. Maybe it's me and somebody else, or maybe just me. How do I handle a portfolio of change and things like that? So in some cases, we want to really address what their needs are. And this is why we're having these conversations about simply, are you a mechanic? Are you going to be a gardener? And in a previous show, we talked about that in a different set. We talked about that in terms of being a recipe follower or a chef. So you can kind of see where we're talking about here, where recipe followers and they use mechanics tools. Those are doing best practices. And we want chefs to experiment and muck around with their garden, creating a new menu for their restaurant, or whatever. And just trying to be creative and always looking for those safety improvements that we can make here. So this isn't an either or, but a both and. You've just got to have that skill set of being a mechanic and a gardener. And really it comes down to where do you spend your time on the job as much as you can. Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. Just don't know if there's any questions. Scott, Andrew, you want any other comments you want to add to that?
Sure, I'll chime in because I really, I'll be honest with you, the chef idea really does resonate with me because I felt that in my last role and then throughout my career, I find that when I first started out in my career, I was definitely a recipe follower. Oh my dear God, it was very prescriptive. Everything must be this. When a boss of mine took me aside one day and he says, "You keep on going on about safety first being number one, safety being number one." Well, it's not. It's about fourth down the line. I thought I was mortified. I was completely mortified. And he explained to me. He says, "No, it falls behind profitability, productivity, quality, and then maybe safety." It made sense. It really did. I mean, he was a true mentor in every sense of the word. And I really started to change how I did things after, while working with him. And really what it was is working with the individuals on the floor because whatever change I make, they're the ones that got to live with it. So I had to work with them. And, it's a lot of slip and slide, Yeah, we try this out. Yeah, this worked great, fantastic, but it may not work for this team. And so we had to be flexible enough to recognize when things were not being accepted or not being followed. And it's not just that it may have been right in every sense of the word, but it may not fit with that group. So yeah, I had to be flexible and just take the creativity of the of the chef and work that way. So yeah, makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Scott, do you have any comments about the Safeopedia audience? Are you getting some feedback of where people need help?
Yeah, well, I would just echoing your comments, Gary, about Safety Connect and how a lot of people are in those small, medium-sized organizations. And I think that safety people are resourceful and resilient and probably move through those different phases kind of intuitively. And so I would suggest, I know for me, taking stock and trying to just understand what stage you're at and whether you're the mechanic or the gardener, because you probably, like I say, move intuitively back and forth, but just to kind of start to recognize, when you're doing those shifts and building that baseline so that you can, even if you don't have the team or the resources, you can start yourself, establishing sort of those baselines. And I liked the pebble idea too of just, recognizing you don't have to make world altering changes, in order to be making progress. So I think those are some really key takeaways because, yeah, I think 50% or more of the audience is working in those smaller organizations and they don't have the resources available to them. So I think those are some little steps or little shifts we can take in our thinking and our perspective.
Great. Yeah, it's really, the approach, if you like the big picture is we're taking a sense-making approach. We're trying to make sense of the current situation. And if you understand where you are, then that tells you these are the tools, these are the decisions that I have to make. And it really makes things a lot easier to kind of get through the day as opposed to being confused on that one there.
Yeah.
All right. So what we did today, and I always like to, end with the 3 takeaways. Well, number 1 is, so when deciding on the wayfinding route to take, blueprints, linear roadmaps, they work well if you're in the ordered system, but not in the complex system. So be very careful that you, number 2, don't do any harm by nailing a screw with a hammer. And the last one, of course, is what we want to do is really want to strengthen robustness as a mechanic, and we want to build resistance as the gardener. And that's it. Okay. So that's about all for today. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Scott, to bring it to a close.
Yeah, well, thank you, Gary, for leading us through that. Thanks, Andrew, again for joining us for part two. I think the grinder is a great example of how to take those different concepts and bring them together and have some meaningful follow-ups or initiatives that everybody can buy into. So thank you so much. We'll have links to the books that Gary referenced and even to the previous podcasts that where we talked about some of those issues, just so people can have easy access. But thank you again for joining and tuning in, and we look forward to next month's episode.
Yep. Thanks, all.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right.